If you were a betting man, John, and now in the state of New Jersey you are allowed to be one, so it's free to say I bet. Will this be the last week we see Nick Foles?
Yeah, that's an interesting bet. It is not nearly 100%, but if I were forced to pick a side of the fence, I would say it's the last week you're going to see Nick Foles. And I'll tell you what, if he plays poorly again, then I think you can pretty much guarantee it's the last day you're going to see Nick Foles.
A lot of the conversation is he's not cleared for contact yet, right? I mean, that's been really the thing holding him back that he had. My question really, like, if he's not cleared for contact, if they come in on Monday and say, all right, he's cleared for contact, boom, is it that simple that you're cleared for contact and now you're ready to play an NFL game?
No, and I think if you listen to Doug closely, and he mentioned a few times, you kind of got to sift through things and pick up little hints along the way. And one of his hints was that he wants him to have a full week of practice before putting him on the field. Obviously, today is Wednesday. It's the first full-scale day. They did practice on Monday because it's not a typical week. But this is the real big practice in the week leading up to Tampa Bay. Still not cleared. And tomorrow, September 13th. And tomorrow is that 9-month period we've talked about a lot. And I think that's a bigger demarcation line than people realize. And that's the line that all the doctors and surgeons point to and say that's typical for the healing process. Now, everybody's a little bit different. Not everybody's the same. And that's what we've kind of talked about since the spring, is Carson seems well ahead of schedule. In reality, he probably is. He probably could be playing right now. But the Eagles want to wait to that 9-month mark, and that's here. So I think forget about the GPS stuff. I explained that yesterday. That's been trending in a positive direction since the summer. We've all known that. I think the issue is the 9-month mark, and now we're on the cusp of it.
We're almost there. We'll see what happens. Nick Foles will start this weekend. The Eagles confirmed that today. I didn't see the press conference. You were there, John. Did Doug seem contentious? Does he seem like he's, again, or was he playful? Because if I'm reading the transcript, it seems he was very brief and very short.
A little bitter.
It seemed like McManus.
No, he wasn't bitter today. A lot of that was joking type things. He isn't going to talk about the quarterbacks a lot. When he did talk about the quarterbacks, he was short, and he announced himself. Nick Foles was the starter. Then when the questions came about Carson Wentz, he was short, but it was more in a playful kind of way than in the past when he's been more testy about it. And he just leans on the fact that he's not cleared for contact, and I believe he's not cleared for contact because we haven't hit 9 months. And once he hits 9 months, he's going to be magically cleared for contact.
Simple as that.
That's my feel. That's my feel of this situation.
So Nick Foles will be the starter week 2 against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm assuming it will be Nate Sudfeld, by the way, who will be the backup in the event that something happened there. So Carson would not be available, possibly week number 3. We shall see where that goes. But some other news around NovaCare, including Alshon Jeffrey. Individual stuff, but does he seem that he's any closer to returning?
Well, he's closer because this is the first time he's been on the field with the team and warming up and even going to that process. To compare him to Carson, for instance, Carson's been doing all that kind of stuff since the spring. Alshon has been on the shelf. He's occasionally worked on the sidelines. Today was the first time he was in the individual drills. So, yeah, he's a lot closer than he was. I think he's kind of behind schedule. If you look at the typical rehab schedule for his shoulder, which was a rotator cuff, it's generally 6 months. He had it in February after the Super Bowl. So he's been a little bit behind. You have to be honest, and he's definitely not going to be out there, obviously, this week, unlikely next week, and I think that is a disappointment.
Yeah, he admitted last week, I guess, to what was that? Jenny Ventris from Sports Illustrated, MMQB, that he was still a few weeks away from returning. So I guess that correlates with all these receivers that the Eagles have been working out. They finally decided to bring back Kamar Aiken, John.
Yeah, and I think, the Eagles are reaching. Let's face it, we've talked about all the receivers they've looked at this week. Some of them bigger names, like Rashad Perryman. They hoped to bring in Corey Coleman. He never got here because he signed with the Patriots. Both of those guys are former first-round picks. So they brought back Kamar, who was here in training camp, had a hamstring injury that kind of derailed his opportunity to make the roster. He's got size. I think that's one thing the Eagles are lacking right now without Alshon Jeffrey and Matt Collins. They don't have that big, rangy receiver on the outside. You saw how they struggled to get the ball outside against the Falcons. I don't know how much he's going to play just getting here. He's also capable on special teams. I expect him to be active. You would think he'd get some more snaps than Marcus Wheaton got last week, and he was released to make room for Kamar. But they have some issues at that position, no question about it.
John, having said that, what can we expect from the Eagles to do differently to try and get this ball down the field against Tampa Bay? And will we see more of Dallas Goedert this week? We didn't see a whole lot of him against Atlanta.
Although they do catch a break with an injury in that Tampa Bay secondary.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you're going to see more of Dallas Goedert simply because it's very difficult to play two tight ends at the same time. I've talked about it a lot, and both of them aren't very good blockers. So I think you're going to see three receivers on the field 70-75% of the time as usual for the Eagles. And I think it depends who those three receivers are and where they're lining up. I don't think you want Nelson Aguilar outside. I think you want him in the slot. But if your other option's DeAndre Carter, who's also a small receiver, is also best suited in the slot, well, somebody's got to go outside. Nelson's better than DeAndre. So is Kamar Aiken going to be able to play as much to take some of those snaps away? I think there's at least some hope, and maybe that's the way it would go. But look, if you roll out those names, it's not an impressive group. Nelson Aguilar I talk about it a lot. He had a breakout season as a second option. He's not a number one option in this league. And when the dominoes start to fall without Alshon Jeffrey, all of a sudden Nelson's number one. That's bad enough. But who's number two? Mike Wallace. Best suited to be a number three as a speed threat. So everybody gets kicked up a notch, and those are ill-suited roles for them.
John, what have you seen from opposing teams as far as how they game plan or how they line up defensively when the Eagles don't have Alshon Jeffrey in the lineup?
Well, we've only seen one team. I mean, the preseason doesn't count, and I would argue the Atlanta Falcons don't count either because the Falcons play cover three. They play Seattle's defense, and they're going to play that whether Alshon is there or Alshon isn't. I think this week will be a better indication of that with Tampa Bay for a number of reasons. One is they're probably going to be down their top two cornerbacks. Vernon Hargreaves is going to be on injured reserve, so he's definitely out. Brent Grimes is probably not going to play. So they have some issues at cornerback, and they're going to have to do some things to mask their deficiencies there. I imagine you're going to see a bunch of zone, and we'll see if those Eagles receivers, it's sort of like not strength versus strength. Let's put it that way when you talk about Eagles receivers versus Buccaneers cornerbacks with all the injuries they have.
We also saw today on the Eagles injury list, which was released a little while, which, it's just Wednesday, but a couple guys limited that should be brought up. One, Shelton Gibson, who's a receiver. They're already light at that spot. Jeffrey was on that list. But the other one was Darren Sproles with a hamstring. And normally you might say, all right, he's an older guy. But when you hear hamstring, I guess the red flags need to go up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, anytime you talk about a skill position and a speed guy and hamstring comes out, whether it's offense or defense, you kind of raise your eyebrow because those may not seem like serious injuries, but those are things that can linger. So the last thing you want to do is sort of fight through it and then turn maybe a week or 2 week injury into a 6 or 7 week injury. So those are always things you have to keep an eye on. Now, the Eagles could be being cautious with Darren Sproles because of the age, because of the wear and tear. He'd be a logical candidate to have days off from practice anyway. So, unfortunately, one of the things that are set up with the Eagles timetables, Doug Pederson talks before practice, and that enables him to evade questions about what happens during practice until the next time he speaks, and that won't be till Friday.
Yeah, and I know Sproles' last game, which, we were talking about this earlier, what his kind of role might be. He had 5 rushes for 10 yards, 4 catches for 22 yards, and he seems to me, John, like the kind of guy that some weeks he might be utilized more. Other weeks they kind of pull him back based on the matchups because last year it seemed like they were going to use him a whole heck of a lot. We talked about it was his last year. Let's get everything out of this guy that we can. That might be a different mindset with him now with more talent around.
Well, it's still his last year, but you could say that a lot about the Eagles because it's a contract year for Jay Ajayi. So a lot of people have speculated that the Eagles might try to run him into the ground because they don't envision re-signing him. Ultimately, I think the committee is what it is. I think we know enough of Doug Pederson through his first 2 seasons to understand it's going to be the 3 guys. It's going to be Ajayi as the lead back, and Darren Sproles is going to be in some key situations. You mentioned those numbers not being impressive. They're not. But if you look at the context, if you look at the big third down conversion on what turned out to be the game-winning drive, that's Darren Sproles getting 8 yards, breaking a tackle, extending the drive, and essentially getting the Eagles in position to win the game. That's the kind of guy Darren Sproles is. So sometimes it goes beyond the numbers.
John, now that week 1's finally behind us in the Philadelphia Eagles, in the first half of that game against the Falcons, it seemed like, correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed like Doug was reserved in his play calling, and then he opened things up a little bit more in the second half. Is that because of week 1? Is that because of Nick Foles? Is that because of Alshon Jeffrey and some other injuries, a little bit of everything? And then how much more will he open it up, if at all, against Tampa Bay?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is the personality of the game. I think a lot of it is not having Carson Wentz, not having Alshon Jeffrey, understanding Nick isn't having a good game. Again, we always talk about Nick Foles, and he says it. He calls himself a rhythm quarterback, so you can kind of understand early on if Nick is going to be hot or he's not. And if he's not, you're in for a fight, and he kind of grind it out. And I think part of the reason it looked better in the second half just had to do with the offensive line dominating. So when they're start to take over a game and you see these huge holes, it's easier to run the ball. Then it becomes easier to play action off that running game. So I think it had more to do with the fact that the offensive line kind of wore an undersized Atlanta defense down and took over the game in the fourth quarter.
Yeah, and this is a week, too, where you mentioned some of the injuries that Tampa has. You would think with those injuries, like that taking some shots down the field might be the way to go, but it's obviously Nick Foles a little different than Carson Wentz and missing out on guys. This could be an interesting game for Mike Wallace, though.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people look at Mike, and he didn't do anything against the Falcons, but, he was open deep on at least one occasion, had his man beat, and Nick underthrew the football drastically. So it's one of the things you have to add into the equation, and the fact that he's a deep threat, he's done his job, he's open, the quarterback didn't get him the football. So there's 2 parts to that equation. And the part against the Falcons was let's be honest, the quarterback didn't play well. The receivers as a whole had 43 yards receiving. Nelson Aguilar had 8 catches for 33 yards. I've never seen that line in my life for a receiver in this league. Running backs put up more numbers as far as yardage after the catch than that. I mean, the Eagles could not throw the ball against the Falcons, and part of it was because Nick simply was having one of those days, and he couldn't get the ball down the field.
Now, you asked Doug about getting him into a rhythm and kind of getting him going, and I would anticipate that that's something they would like to do. And some of that is, some of those short passes, but I guess that's an indication that they might try to take some more shots down the field once they get him going.
Yeah, I don't
now
think
that he has a game under his belt.
Yeah, if he starts in the first quarter making a few throws, it gives you more confidence. I think, one of the things in Nick's defense is that was probably the worst game Zach Ertz ever played, and I don't think that's going to happen again. He had a couple drops that would have made things look at least a little bit better. If you start gaining some confidence from the quarterback, you're going to take more shots. And again, the Buccaneers' 2 most talented corners and one of their most talented players of all, Vernon Hargreaves, is definitely out. The 2 top corners, if you add Grimes, are probably going to be out. So there's going to be some opportunities to make some plays, even without Alshon Jeffrey, and we'll see if the Eagles are able to do it.
John, I want to switch gears to the defensive side of the ball real quick. Nigel Bradham is finally back here. Jordan Hicks is coming off a monster game. I asked Dave Weinberg this at the Atlantic City Press earlier, and I want to ask you the same question. How good can the duo of Bradham and Hicks potentially be this season with him coming back now this week?
Yeah, I asked Jim Schwartz about that, and he gave one of his famous baseball analogies, bringing up Frank Tanana, if anybody remembers him. He called it a silver lining because it's been a long time since he's had Jordan and Nigel on the field at the same time. And he's had to do multiple things to replace one or the other. And in a weird way, it's made the Eagles defense a little bit more unpredictable. They use a lot of different packages. And that can confuse the offense at times. But then he sort of went back full circle and said there's nothing like having your fastball. And that's what he compares having 2-3 down linebackers, because you don't need all those moving parts. You don't have to mask the fact that one of them is not in there. Those can be, if you want them to be, they can be on the field every single play, and that makes it easier to play defense.
Talk about the rotations on the defensive line. I know we asked you this before, but your thoughts on how they handled that against the Falcons, and what will they do differently this week, if anything at all? Is Michael Bennett going to get more snaps as the season goes on, less, Chris Long, et cetera?
Well, I don't think much is going to change. I think ultimately at some point when the conditioning is completely back, Brandon Graham will play a little bit more. But this team believes in a rotation. It's one of the strengths of their team. It's something everybody else wants to copy, and a lot of other coaches talk about copying it. They don't necessarily do it because I think it takes a lot of discipline from the coaching staff. They want to use that rotation. They're certainly going to use it this week because it's going to be 90 degrees in Tampa, high humidity. So this is not the week where you want to ramp up guys. If anything, the one guy who played a whole heck of a lot was Fletcher Cox against the Falcons. If anything, I think he will be ramped down a little bit because you don't want to get in that bad habit of playing him 90+% of the snaps, and all of a sudden later in the season he's banged up or he's tired. So I think that's the one thing they can do a little bit differently, and that's control the pitch count of Fletcher Cox a little bit more. I know everybody's excited about him and his goal of being the NFL Defensive Player of the Year. And I can tell you Jim Schwartz could not give a you-know-what about that. He wants him to be the impactful player. And if that means limiting his snaps, he's going to limit his snaps.
Well, that should be an interesting matchup, and also as we'll dive deeper into these matchups later on in the week, but that secondary, depending on whether or not Deshaun Jackson is able to go, but Goodwin's a nice possession guy, Evans is a big physical guy, and if D-Jack can go, they've got a nice complement of wide receivers there against this Eagles secondary, so that should be a fun matchup this week to watch, the Eagles secondary against these guys, which, the one area the Eagles are a little smaller in that secondary.
Well, everybody's smaller than the Bucs receivers. I mean, they're huge, and you got to add the two tight ends who are 6'6" into that as well. And Mike Evans, Deshaun, let's be realistic, he's probably not going to play. It's just difficult to get cleared in this league in 1 week any longer, especially for guys who've had multiple concussions, and he's one of those. So I would be stunned if he's cleared in time for the game. But you still have talent, but that is going to help because we know Deshaun Jackson ever since he left here, and it's a different regime that sort of got rid of him. It has nothing to do with Doug Pederson and Joe Douglas, but he holds some animus to this organization, and basically every time he's played him, he's gotten a big play. He's probably not going to be out there, and that's going to help the Eagles.
All right, week 2 is on the way. Of course, we got plenty more, including the Eagles and Buccaneers coverage all week long here on the Sports Bash Live on 97.3 ESPN. We'll have Thursday Night Football tomorrow. We got plenty of NFL news and notes around the league that we will dive in on tomorrow's show as well. John McMullen here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN. Thanks, John.
Hey, thank you, guys.